Get down! The HOA tyrant screamed, his black gun pointed straight at my daughter's head, just because she dared to violate a parking regulation. But then, in a split second, his eyes shifted from aggressive to absolute terror. The bullet was still in the chamber, but the Glock had changed owners. My daughter, who had just disarmed him with lightning-fast movement, calmly said, "I've trained Navy SEALs to kill people in 37 different ways. Is incorrect parking the 38th? The entire neighborhood froze. 3 minutes later, real police arrived and an 8-year empire began to crumble, all because this fake cop chose the wrong victim. The look on his face when he realized what he'd done is something I'll never forget for as long as I live. It was the beginning of a battle that would transform not just our community, but potentially HOAs across America. What state are you watching from? Drop a comment below. I bet the HOA in your area has these power-hungry types too. We've heard from viewers in all 50 states who've dealt with similar situations. And believe me, what happened in our neighborhood could happen anywhere. When my daughter Maragold visited, it had been 6 months since we'd last seen her. Sunny Pines was normally peaceful, but the HOA kept a watchful eye on everything. I'm Jetstorm, retired NASA aerospace engineer, and my wife and I had been living in this upscale neighborhood for 15 years. We'd followed every ridiculous rule they'd thrown at us, from the mandatory desert beige mailboxes to the strictly regulated height of our lawn grass, no taller than 2 inches, measured weekly, and even restrictions on what flowers could be planted in our front yard, only drought-resistant, aesthetically cohesive varieties approved by the landscaping committee. Maragold pulled up in her modified military Jeep around noon. From the window, I could see the exhaustion in her face. She had just completed a 72-hour non-stop training session with her SEAL trainees and driven 3 hours straight to see us. At 36, Maragold had 12 years of military experience specializing in training Navy SEALs in tactical operations and survival psychology under extreme stress. Tough doesn't begin to describe her, but that day she looked ready to collapse. Her normally alert hazel eyes were bloodshot from fatigue, and her athletic frame moved with the deliberate precision of someone fighting against total exhaustion. "Dad, can you help with these boxes?" she called from the driveway. "I brought you guys some equipment for the house." Maragold had parked in the visitor spot near our home. Technically only allowed for 30 minutes, but she had several heavy boxes to unload, including a specialized security system she wanted to install for us after a series of break-ins in a neighboring community. We were halfway through bringing in the last of the equipment when her phone rang. Maragold checked the caller ID, and her expression immediately changed. "I need to take this," she said, looking concerned. "It's about one of my trainees who's having a serious PTSD episode. He was in a particularly rough operation last year, and the anniversary is triggering him." The call lasted nearly 25 minutes, during which time Maragold sat on the couch, speaking in that calm, authoritative voice she uses during crisis situations. I could hear her walking the young man through breathing exercises, reminding him of his training, and coordinating with on-base personnel to provide immediate support. I could tell this was serious. She was talking someone down from a dangerous mental state using the specialized training techniques she'd developed specifically for elite operators experiencing combat trauma. By the time she hung up, we had completely forgotten about moving the Jeep, and Maragold looked even more drained than before. "Sorry about that," she sighed, rubbing her temples. "Sometimes these kids carry more weight than they can handle. We push them to their limits physically, but the mental battles are the hardest to train for. He'll be okay now. My colleague is with him, and they've got a crisis team on standby." Ravina brought out a glass of water and some ibuprofen for Maragold, who accepted them gratefully. "You should eat something," my wife insisted, already moving toward the kitchen to reheat the lunch we had prepared. Maragold nodded, closing her eyes briefly. I could see the weight of responsibility she carried for her trainees. These young men and women whose lives might one day depend on the skills and mental fortitude she was helping them develop. We were just sitting down for lunch when the doorbell rang, not a normal ring, but an aggressive, repeated pounding that made the doorframe shake. "Who the hell is that?" I muttered, rising from my chair. "Sounds like the FBI raiding a drug den." When I opened the door, there stood Nero Wilder, our neighborhood self-appointed security chief, decked out in what looked like a police uniform, but with an HOA patch sloppily sewn onto the sleeve. At 58, Wilder, a self-proclaimed fitness expert, was about to start a battle that would end with someone leaving our neighborhood for good. "Your daughter needs to move that military monstrosity immediately. It's been in the visitor spot for 43 minutes. That's 13 minutes over the limit." He had a clipboard in one hand and was already writing up what I assumed was a violation notice, his pen pressing so hard into the paper I thought it might tear. Behind his mirrored sunglasses, I could see the gleam of satisfaction. Wilder lived for these moments. He'd been a security guard at the local shopping mall before being fired for excessive force against a teenage shoplifter. Now he'd found the perfect outlet for his need to control others in our HOA's Byzantine rule book. Before I could respond, Maragold appeared beside me, wiping her hands on a kitchen towel. I could see she'd composed herself, her military bearing automatically asserting itself in the face of confrontation, despite her exhaustion. "I'm sorry about that, sir," she said, politely, her voice neutral but respectful, the same tone she probably used with difficult superior officers. "I just finished a marathon training session and a long drive. I needed to unload some heavy equipment for my parents and then got caught on an emergency call with one of my trainees. I'll move it in 15 minutes once I've had something to eat." Wilder's face hardened, the lines around his mouth deepening into a scowl. In the 8 years since he'd been appointed to the HOA Security Committee by Nancy Weber, the HOA president, he'd gained a reputation for inflexibility that bordered on sadistic. Neighborhood children were afraid of him. Elderly residents would literally turn around and walk the other way when they saw him coming. The rules clearly state 30 minutes maximum. I've already called a tow truck. That'll be $300 for the tow, plus $500 for violating Section 4.3 of the HOA regulations. He seemed to be reciting these numbers from memory, like he'd rehearsed them. I noticed the way his chest puffed out slightly when he mentioned the regulations, as if the mere existence of these rules somehow elevated his own importance. Maragold's face remained calm, but I could recognize the slight narrowing of her eyes, the same look she'd get as a teenager when someone pushed her too far. It was subtle, but I knew my daughter well enough to see the wheels turning behind that composed expression. "Mr. Wilder, I understand there are rules, but surely there's room for reasonable accommodation. I've been helping my elderly parents with heavy lifting after driving 3 hours on no sleep. I simply need 15 minutes to eat something, and then I'll move the vehicle." I could see Maragold deliberately softening her stance, even using the phrase elderly parents to appeal to some sense of decency that, in retrospect, Wilder clearly didn't possess. Instead of responding to this reasonable request, Wilder pulled out his phone and started recording Maragold, holding it inches from her face in a clear attempt to provoke a reaction. "I'm documenting your refusal to comply with HOA regulations. This will result in additional penalties." His voice took on an official tone that would have been comical if it wasn't so infuriating. "I have the authority to ensure compliance in this community. Do you know how many troublemakers I've had to deal with? People like you think the rules don't apply to them." Maragold sighed deeply, and I could see her consciously choosing to de-escalate despite Wilder's provocations. "I'm not refusing to comply. I'm requesting the reasonable accommodation due to extenuating circumstances. I'll move the vehicle shortly." She turned to go back inside, clearly trying to end the confrontation before it could escalate. That's when it happened. Wilder reached out and grabbed her arm, his fingers digging into her bicep. "You don't walk away when I'm talking to you." His voice had risen to a shout, and I saw my neighbor across the street peek out their window at the commotion. What happened next occurred in a flash. Despite her exhaustion, 12 years of military training kicked in automatically. Maragold, with military precision, swiftly disarmed Wilder, sending him stumbling backward into Ravina's rose bushes. The look on his face as he scrambled to his feet was a mixture of shock, humiliation, and rage. His carefully constructed facade of authority had just been shattered in seconds, and worse, there had been witnesses. His sunglasses had fallen off, revealing small, watery eyes that bulged with fury. "You just assaulted a security official in duty." "Officer?" he screamed, his face turning an alarming shade of red as thorns from the rosebush clung to his uniform. "I'm coming back with real police." As he stormed off, dropping citation papers in his wake, I turned to Maragold, who looked slightly stunned at her own reflexive action. "I didn't mean to do that," she said quietly. "It was pure muscle memory. When someone grabs you like that," she trailed off, shaking her head. Neither of us knew that 20 minutes later the gun Wilder was hiding under his jacket would be drawn and pointed straight at my daughter's fate. And at that moment, she would have no choice but to use every skill the military had taught her. Maragold had just finished explaining what happened when we heard car doors slamming outside. "He's back," I said, peeking through the curtains. Wilder was marching up our driveway with the determined stride of someone about to do something monumentally stupid. But this time, he wasn't alone. He'd brought 2 other HOA members with him. Carl Johnson, a timid former accountant in his 60s who always followed Wilder around out of fear his own home would become a target. Wilder had once had Carl's vintage car towed for being unsightly. And Xenia Ramirez, a 40-year-old child psychologist who had recently moved into the neighborhood and didn't yet understand the dynamics at play. From the confused look on Xenia's face, I suspected Wilder had fed her some story about dangerous trespassers to get her to come along. She kept glancing uncertainly between Wilder and our house. Maragold had used a few minutes to compose herself, using the breathing technique she taught her SEAL trainees for high-stress situations. Though still physically exhausted, her mind was now alert, anticipating trouble. I watched her subtly position herself between us and the door, a protective stance so ingrained she probably didn't even realize she was doing it. "Let me handle this," she said calmly, her voice dropping into what I recognized as her instructor mode. "I've dealt with worse situations in far more dangerous places. Just stay back and let me talk to them." The doorbell rang again, this time accompanied by Wilder's voice shouting, "Security, come out immediately." The command in his voice was clearly an imitation of police procedurals he'd watched on television. Maragold opened the door and stepped onto the porch to prevent Wilder from entering our home, positioning herself squarely in the door. What happened next still gives me nightmares. Wilder stood at the bottom of our porch steps, and in one swift motion, he reached inside his jacket and pulled out a black handgun, a Glock 19. He pointed it directly at Maragold's face, his hand visibly shaking with what might have been fear, adrenaline, or simple inexperience with firearms. "On the ground now," he shouted, attempting to mimic police procedure he'd probably seen on television. "You're under arrest for assaulting an officer." Behind him, Carl's face drained of color and Xenia gasped, clearly not expecting this escalation. "Mr. Wilder," she stammered, taking several steps back, "you didn't say anything about guns. This isn't what you said we were coming here for." Carl looked like he might pass out, his eyes darting between Wilder's gun and Maragold, clearly regretting his decision to come along on this disastrous mission. Maragold didn't move. I watched in horror from the doorway as my daughter assessed the situation with preternatural calm. The distance between her and Wilder, approximately 12 feet. Carl and Xania's positions to the right about 5 feet back from Wilder. Wilder's trembling trigger finger, a serious concern for accidental discharge. She also noted neighborhood witnesses across the street. The Hendersons were now openly watching from their driveway, and potential escape routes. This entire tactical assessment likely took less than 2 seconds, something she had been trained to do automatically in potentially life-threatening situations. When she spoke, her voice carried the weight and authority that had made her an exceptional trainer. "Mr. Wilder, you are committing a felony by pointing a firearm at me. Lower your weapon immediately." The command in her voice made even me want to obey. But Wilder was too far gone in his power trip, too invested in his fantasy of authority to back down now. "I'm the law in this community," he shouted, spittle flying from his mouth as the gun wavered dangerously in his unsteady hand. A clear sign to anyone with firearms training that an accidental discharge was a real possibility. What happened next unfolded in what felt like slow motion. Maragold began talking calmly, using hostage negotiation techniques as she imperceptibly shifted her weight forward. "I understand you feel disrespected, Mr. Wilder. Let's talk about this without the weapon. You don't want to make a mistake that will change your life forever." Her voice remained steady, almost conversational, designed to diffuse rather than escalate. "Think about what happens after you pull that trigger. Is a parking space worth spending the rest of your life in prison?" She took one small step down, then another, her movement so gradual that Wilder didn't seem to register that she was closing the distance between them. I could see his grip tightening on the gun, a preparation to fire that Maragold, with her specialized training, recognized immediately. In that moment, Maragold moved with the decisive precision that had made her an elite military operative. He executed a disarming technique taught to SEAL operators, a sharp strike to Wilder's wrist to deflect the muzzle, simultaneously twisting his arm and seizing control of the weapon. The motion was practiced, efficient, and executed at exactly the right moment when Wilder's focus had momentarily wavered. The struggle lasted about 8 seconds, not the 3-second smooth disarm you see in movies, but a tense real-life confrontation with Wilder yelling and attempting to maintain his grip on the gun. I heard Ravina gasp behind me, and across the street, Mrs. Henderson was already on her phone, presumably calling 911. When it was over, Maragold had Wilder face down on our lawn, his arm locked behind him in a control position, the Glock safely in her other hand, finger properly indexed outside the trigger guard, as any responsible firearms handler would do. Xania and Carl stood frozen in shock as my daughter, still breathing heavily from the exertion, instructed me to call the real police. "Tell them there's been an armed assault and the weapon has been secured," she said with the same calm she might use to order coffee. "Make sure they know the situation is under control, but that the suspect was armed and may still be dangerous." I had already dialed 911, but I had no idea this was just the beginning of our battle with the mini empire that Wilder and Nancy had built in our neighborhood over the past 8 years. I couldn't have imagined they would be able to mobilize the entire local justice system against us, or that a simple parking dispute would uncover a web of corruption that extended far beyond our quiet suburban streets. Officer Rodriguez arrived shortly, finding Maragold calmly restraining Wilder on the lawn, surrounded by violation notices and crushed rose bushes. She explained the situation with military precision, how Wilder had threatened her with a deadly weapon after a dispute over a parking violation, how she had been forced to disarm him for her own safety. "I have secured the firearm and rendered it safe," she told Rodriguez, who seemed impressed by her calm demeanor. "The magazine has been removed and the chamber cleared. There are no other weapons on his person that I could detect during the restraint." Rodriguez took careful notes as Maragold explained her background and training, which clearly lent credibility to her account. Wilder was handcuffed and placed in the back of the police car, still shouting threats and invoking his authority as HOA security, demanding that Officer Rodriguez recognize his jurisdiction in the neighborhood. "We'll need statements from all witnesses," he nodded toward the neighbors who had gathered to watch the commotion. "This is a serious incident." His partner was already interviewing Carl and Xania, both of whom looked shaken. Carl kept wringing his hands and glancing nervously at Wilder in the police car, while Xania was explaining animatedly, clearly distancing herself from Wilder's actions. I felt a wave of relief, believing the system would work as it should. That relief was short-lived. Less than 2 hours later, while we were still giving our statements at the local police station, the atmosphere suddenly changed. Officers who had been professional and concerned began exchanging looks and whispering among themselves. Then I saw why. Nancy Weber had arrived with Police Chief Thompson. They strode into the station like they owned it. Nancy in her immaculate business suit and pearl necklace, Thompson with his chest puffed out importantly. I immediately recognized their relationship from community events. Nancy's husband James was Thompson's golfing buddy, and the HOA made regular contributions to the police fund, mostly for community safety initiatives that never seemed to materialize. "There seems to have been a misunderstanding," Chief Thompson announced, reviewing the paperwork with barely a glance. His dismissive tone made it clear he'd already decided the outcome before hearing any evidence. Mr. Wilder was performing his community safety duties when he was attacked. I watched in disbelief as Wilder was uncuffed and his gun returned to him, Thompson clapping him on the shoulder like an old friend. "But he pointed a loaded weapon at my daughter over a parking space," protested, feeling my blood pressure rise. "There are multiple witnesses." Thompson fixed me with a cold stare, the kind that reminded you exactly who held power in this town. "According to Mr. Wilder, he only drew his weapon after feeling threatened by your daughter, who he claims has military combat training. It's her word against his, and without clear evidence." He let the implication hang in the air, deliberately ignoring the fact that neighbors had witnessed the entire incident. Nancy Weber stood beside him, a satisfied smile on her face that made me want to throw something. That evening, we learned an emergency HOA meeting had been called for the following night. Through a sympathetic neighbor who served on the landscaping committee, we obtained a copy of the agenda. Vote to evict the Storm family for violating community safety standards and assaulting security personnel. The document was full of inflammatory language, describing Maragold as dangerously unstable and a threat to community safety. Maragold didn't panic. Instead, she called Michael Chen, her college friend who had become a civil rights attorney specializing in HOA overreach cases. "This isn't just about parking anymore," she told him, pacing our living room with a phone pressed to her ear. "There's something bigger happening here. They're using the HOA as a personal fief, and they've got the police chief in their pocket." As Michael arrived the next day, sleek in his tailored suit and carrying a briefcase full of legal documents, we noticed our neighbors avoiding eye contact, hurrying inside when they saw us. The fear was palpable. Everyone knew what happened to those who crossed Wilder and Nancy. The Patelises had their garden destroyed after complaining about arbitrary rule changes. The Gonzaleses faced weekly inspections for months after questioning a special assessment fee. The fear was a tool, carefully cultivated over years. Maragold and Michael discovered Wilder's criminal history, including a sealed assault record and connections to the police chief. The pattern was becoming clear. Wilder had a history of violence that Thompson had helped conceal. More disturbing was what they found about previous residents who had crossed the HOA. One elderly couple, the Rosenbergs, had been forced to sell their home at a significant loss after continuous harassment and escalating fines for violations that no one else was cited for, only for the property to be purchased by Nye's brother at below market value and flipped for a substantial profit months later. This wasn't just petty tyranny. It was a real estate scam dressed up as community governance. Our mailbox filled with violation notices. $500 for improper lawn maintenance. Our grass was a 1/4 inch too tall according to Wilder's specially calibrated measuring tool. $1,000 for unauthorized exterior modifications, a security camera Maragold had installed after Wilder's gun incident, and finally a $10,000 fine for creating community disturbance, along with a threat of legal action seeking much more. HOA inspectors, really just Wilder's friends, began patrolling outside our home 24/7, photographing and noting every activity. Our water was temporarily shut off for maintenance that somehow only affected our house, and we received warnings that electricity might be next due to safety concerns that were never specified. "They're trying to make us leave," Maragold observed as we sat in our darkened living room that evening, using flashlights because our porch lights had mysteriously stopped working after a surprise electrical inspection. But they don't know who they're dealing with. Each threatening letter, each illegal surveillance action is just another piece of evidence. I'm building. She leaned forward, her face illuminated by the flashlight's beam, and I recognized the determined look that had helped her survive 12 years in some of the most dangerous places on Earth. And I've just discovered something explosive about how Wilder and Nancy have been embezzling HOA funds for years. And some of that money has been going straight into Police Chief Thompson's pocket. They've created a perfect little corrupt system, but systems have weaknesses, and finding weaknesses is exactly what I trained SEALs to do. The situation escalated as Maragold documented violations and Wilder continued his harassment. His patrol car would park outside our house at night, headlights shining directly into the bedrooms, the engine revving occasionally to wake us. He'd follow Rava when she went grocery shopping, staying just close enough to be intimidating without technically breaking any laws. Strange inspections were conducted daily, sometimes multiple times, for increasingly absurd violations. The angle of our mailbox was supposedly 2 degrees off. The shade of white on our window trim didn't match the approved color palette exactly. The birds visiting our feeder were non-native species and therefore prohibited. One morning, we woke to find our garden destroyed. Plants uprooted, ornaments smashed, even the small bench Rava sat on while tending her flowers had been splintered into pieces. This vandalism was followed an hour later by a violation notice for unsightly yard conditions, with another $1,000 fine. The psychological toll was beginning to show on my wife, who had begun having trouble sleeping, jumping at every sound outside. But Maragold remained focused, her military training preparing her for exactly this kind of sustained pressure campaign. Maragold had set up discreet surveillance cameras capturing evidence of Wilder's harassment, including him sabotaging our sprinkler system, methodically opening each control valve just enough to ensure a slow leak that would drive up our water bill. "I'm following the money trail," Maragold and Michael worked with Rebecca Torres, a former HOA treasurer, who had gathered evidence of the HOA's financial corruption. Those records revealed a shocking pattern of financial abuse that went beyond petty power trips. The HOA collected over $600,000 annually from Sunny Pines residents, but much of that money was being diverted through a complex web of fraudulent payments. $75,000 annually for security services, essentially Wilder's personal salary for harassing residents. $120,000 for management consulting to a shell company owned by Nancy that performed no actual services, and various inflated maintenance contracts to companies owned by their friends and family that charged triple the market rate for subpar work. Most disturbing was a regular payment listed as Community Safety Fund contribution that went directly to a campaign account for Police Chief Thompson. Carefully disguised as legitimate donations, but clearly representing hush money for turning a blind eye to their activities. They've stolen over $250,000 from the community in the past 5 years, Michael concluded after reviewing the documents, whistling low under his breath. This isn't just an HOA issue anymore. This is criminal conspiracy, fraud, embezzlement, and probably tax evasion too. Maragold organized secret meetings with disgruntled residents at Michael's home outside the neighborhood to avoid surveillance. Gradually, people began to share their stories. The Martinezes had been fined because their children were too noisy playing in their own backyard. Mrs. Johnson had been threatened with legal action because her son with autism sometimes wandered into other yards. The Levines had faced relentless harassment after questioning why the community pool renovation kept being delayed despite increased fees. They discovered Wilder had been routinely entering the backyards and even homes of residents while they were away, an illegal activity captured on several home security systems but never reported due to fear of retaliation. Even more disturbing, they found emails between Nancy and Wilder discussing strategies to clean up the neighborhood by forcing out undesirable families through targeted harassment and selective enforcement of rules, a euphemism for pushing out elderly residents, families with children, and minorities who didn't fit their vision of an exclusive community. They've created a perfect little system, George Williams explained at one of these meetings, his voice carrying the weight of his decades as a judge. The 70-year-old former federal judge had been meticulously collecting every HOA email and meeting minutes for 10 years as a personal hobby. Driven by a lifelong commitment to justice, Nancy creates the rules, Wilder enforces them against people they want out, and Police Chief Thompson ensures no complaints ever stick. Meanwhile, they're all getting rich off our HOA fees while property values drop for anyone they target, allowing their friends to buy low and sell high months later. They've created a perfect little system. As the evidence mounted, Michael built a comprehensive legal case and contacted the FBI regarding Chief Thompson's corruption. This goes beyond HOA abuse. This is systematic corruption of local government. We've got enough here to trigger a federal investigation. The breaking point came when Wilder and Nancy filed a lawsuit against Maragold for defamation and disorderly conduct, demanding $500,000 in damages and our immediate eviction from Sunny Pines. The lawsuit was filled with outrageous lies, claiming Maragold had threatened Wilder's life, that she was running an illegal business from her home, and that she represented a clear and present danger to the community. "They think they've backed me into a corner with this lawsuit," Maragold said, as she reviewed the legal papers spread across our dining room table, her expression not worried but calculating. But a seal never counterattacks when cornered. We always have a plan already in motion. This isn't just about a wrongly parked car anymore. It's about exposing a corruption system that's existed for too long. And tomorrow at the HOA meeting will be the debut of Operation Exposure. The community center was packed for the HOA meeting, the tension so thick you could almost see it hanging in the air. Nancy had made attendance mandatory, threatening fines for absence, ensuring a captive audience for what she clearly expected to be our public humiliation. Wilder stood by the door in his full security and uniform, complete with a new badge that looked suspiciously similar to actual police credentials, deliberately blocking several residents who were known to be sympathetic to our cause. I watched as he turned away the Johnsons, an elderly couple who had spoken with Maragold earlier that week, claiming the meeting was at capacity. A transparent lie given the empty seats at the back of the room. Nancy called the meeting to order with a smug confidence that made my blood boil, tapping her gavel with unnecessary force. "Today we're voting on the removal of the Storm family from our community," she announced, without preamble, not even bothering with the usual formalities of approving minutes from the previous meeting. "Their dangerous and disruptive behavior cannot be tolerated in our peaceful neighborhood. As you all know, their daughter physically assaulted our security officer and has been spreading malicious lies about our association management." She proceeded to portray Maragold as a violent military type who posed a threat to community safety, claiming the parking incident was just the latest in a pattern of rule-breaking that endangered property values and community standards. The characterization was so wildly at odds with reality that I had to clench my fists to keep from interrupting. Throughout this character assassination, Maragold sat calmly in the front row, dressed professionally in a blazer and slacks, her posture perfect, her expression unreadable. She had insisted on arriving early to secure front row seats, positioning herself directly in Nancy's line of sight, a psychological tactic that clearly irritated the HOA president, who kept losing her place in her prepared remarks. When Nancy finally paused for breath after a particularly vicious allegation about Maragold's unstable tendencies, my daughter raised her hand with deliberate slowness. Before the vote, I'd like to exercise my right to respond to these allegations as provided in Section 7 of the HOA bylaws regarding due process in disciplinary actions. Her voice was calm but carried to every corner of the room without effort, the same voice that could command attention on a noisy battlefield. Nancy hesitated, clearly caught off guard that Maragold knew the rules so well. "We don't really have time for," she began, but George Williams stood up from the back row, his tall frame and silver hair lending him natural authority. "Point of order," he called out in his authoritative judge's voice that had once presided over federal cases. "The bylaws clearly state that any resident facing punitive action has the right to address the community before a vote. That's been the rule since 1992 when the association was first formed. It's on page 17, paragraph 4 of the governing documents." Murmurs spread through the room as Nancy reluctantly yielded the floor, her face flushing with barely controlled anger. Maragold connected her laptop to the projector and began a meticulously prepared presentation that represented weeks of investigation. "This isn't about a parking violation," she began, her voice steady and matter-of-fact. "It's about systematic abuse of power and financial fraud that has victimized every homeowner in this room." She displayed spreadsheets showing the HOA's financial records, highlighting the suspicious payments to Wilder, Nancy, and their associates. The projected numbers were color-coded and annotated, making the discrepancies impossible to miss, even for those without financial training. "Your annual dues of $3,000 per household aren't going to community improvements," she explained, clicking through to a pie chart that showed the actual allocation of funds. "They're going into the pockets of the people running this HOA through inflated contracts, fake security services, and consulting fees for work that's never performed." Nancy tried repeatedly to interrupt her, her face growing redder by the minute, but residents shouted her down, engrossed in the financial revelations. Many were taking photographs of the slides with their phones, documenting the evidence. Wilder began moving toward Maragold with clear intimidation in his stance, his hand drifting toward the spot where his gun would normally be. But several larger men from the community, including Mr. Patel and Mr. Gonzalez, both of whom had suffered years of harassment, stepped into his path, silently forming a protective barrier between him and the presentation. Just as Nancy reached for her phone, presumably to call Chief Thompson for backup, the community center door swung open with dramatic timing that couldn't have been better if we'd planned it. Police Chief Anderson from the neighboring county entered, accompanied by a stern-looking woman in a suit who immediately commanded attention. "Nancy Weber and Nero Wilder," the woman called out, her voice carrying official weight. "I'm Special Agent Carter with the FBI. We're investigating allegations of fraud, embezzlement, and corruption related to the management of the Sunny Pines Homeowners Association and potential criminal conspiracy involving local law enforcement." The room erupted in gasps and whispers as Nancy's face drained of color, her carefully maintained composure crumbling visibly. She attempted to adjourn the meeting, frantically pounding her gavel, but the residents refused to leave, blocking the exits and demanding answers. What followed was a cascade of revelations that unfolded like the final act of a courtroom drama. Rebecca Tortes stepped forward with original financial documents showing years of fraudulent activity. her hands shaking, but her voice steady, as she explained how she'd been silenced when she first discovered the discrepancies. "They threatened to destroy my catering business if I spoke up," she told the stunned audience. "I was afraid, but I couldn't let it continue." Maragold played videos of Wilder trespassing on private property and brandishing his unauthorized firearm, the high-definition footage clearly showing his face as he snuck through backyards and peered into windows. Michael presented evidence of how Nancy and Wilder had systematically harassed and forced out numerous families over the years, connecting the dots between their departure and subsequent below-market property purchases by Nancy's associates. One by one, residents stood up to share their experiences of intimidation and fear, finding courage in numbers and the presence of law enforcement not controlled by Thompson. Mrs. Gonzalez described being fined $2,000 because her Christmas lights stayed up one day too long after her husband was hospitalized with a heart attack. Mr. Patel revealed how Wilder had threatened to report his home-based software consulting business to immigration authorities if he complained about arbitrary rule changes that seemed targeted at families of South Asian descent. The Johnsons, who had snuck in through the back door after being turned away, explained how their handicap ramp had been deemed architecturally inconsistent and torn down while they were on vacation, leaving their daughter, who used a wheelchair, unable to enter their home without being carried. As Chief Anderson announced Wilder's arrest on multiple charges, including unlicensed possession of a firearm, criminal threatening, trespassing, and impersonating a law enforcement officer, I watched the realization dawn on Wilder's face. The mask of authority crumbled, replaced by the expression of a small man seeing his fantasy world collapse. How had this happened? How had a regular woman dismantle his entire power structure? Nancy attempted to leave but was intercepted by Agent Carter with embezzlement and fraud charges. When the handcuffs closed around Wilder's wrists, I caught a glimpse of utter disbelief in his eyes. Perhaps he was wondering how his empire had crumbled so completely. But the story wasn't over yet, because I still had one final ace up my sleeve, something that would change how HOAs operate across America. To come forward with their own experiences of intimidation and abuse. His tough guy facade crumbled during the preliminary hearing, where he reportedly broke down crying when denied bail due to being a danger to the community, the very phrase he had used to describe Maragold. Nancy Weber faced charges of embezzlement, fraud, bribery, and extortion. Her carefully cultivated image as a community leader in tatters. The forensic audit revealed she had personally diverted over $300,000 of HOA funds into her own accounts, disguised as consulting fees and service contracts. Police Chief Thompson was placed on administrative leave pending an investigation into corruption and abuse of power, his reputation destroyed by evidence that he had accepted bribes to ignore complaints about Wilder and selectively enforce laws to benefit NY's property scheme. The case made headlines throughout the state, prompting investigations into numerous other HOAs with similar patterns of abuse. Reporters discovered that what had happened in Sunny Pines wasn't isolated. It was part of a growing trend of HOA corruption across the country. Our community held an emergency election to appoint a new HOA board with strict transparency requirements and checks on power. The bylaws were completely rewritten to require financial audits, term limits for board members, and resident-led oversight of all decisions. Jennifer Lopez, a 42-year-old resident with a background in community management and law, was elected as the new president. Her first action was to reduce HOA fees by 40%, eliminating all the inflated contracts and unnecessary security expenditures while still maintaining enough funding for proper community maintenance. "We're going to show that an HOA can actually serve its residents, not rule over them," she announced at her first meeting to enthusiastic applause. Sanaya Ramirez approached Maragold at this meeting, her professional confidence momentarily set aside. "I owe you an apology," she said, her voice trembling slightly with emotion. Wilder told me there was a dangerous trespasser threatening the neighborhood. I had no idea he was talking about you or that he would pull a gun. I should have questioned him more, used my training to see through his manipulation. This was the beginning of a friendship that would prove vital in the coming months, as Zanaya's expertise in psychology would help many residents process the trauma of living under Wilder and NY's regime. The legal consequences were swift and substantial once the full extent of the corruption was exposed. Wilder accepted a plea deal for 5 years in prison plus restitution, avoiding a potential 20-year sentence only by agreeing to testify against Thompson and provide details of the entire scheme. Nancy received 3 years and was ordered to repay all embezzled funds to the community, her carefully accumulated wealth seized as proceeds of criminal activity. Thompson resigned in disgrace before being indicted on federal corruption charges. Families who'd been forced to sell their homes below market value received compensation for their losses from the seized assets, a small measure of justice for those who had lost their homes and community. But the most significant development came from Maragold herself. 6 weeks after the HOA meeting, she called the community together again to reveal her final ace. She had been working with Michael to establish a non-profit organization called Community Shield. The concept had come to her during those sleepless nights when Wilder's harassment was at its peak, born from the realization that what was happening to us was happening to thousands of others across the country with no resources to fight back. What happened in Sunny Pines isn't unique, she explained to the gathered residents and media representatives who had come to cover the aftermath of the scandal. HOA abuse happens across the country, with little recourse for victims who don't happen to have a family member with military training and legal connections. Community Shield will provide free legal counsel to those facing HOA intimidation, train residents to document and counteract abuse of power, and advocate for legislative changes to HOA regulations. Using her military experience, Maragold developed a comprehensive set of community defense strategies to help people protect their rights without escalation to violence. These included detailed guides on proper documentation of harassment, establishing neighborhood support networks, and navigating the legal system effectively. She created online training modules for community organizers, teaching them how to identify patterns of abuse and build cases against corrupt board members. The organization received immediate national attention, with similar cases from across the country flooding in. Within its first year, Community Shield assisted dozens of communities in standing up against abusive HOAs, successfully removing corrupt board members and recovering misappropriated funds in over 30 cases nationwide. Sunny Pines transformed into a model for healthy HOA management with transparent rules and balanced power structures that other communities began to emulate. The STORM standard, as it came to be known in property management circles, incorporated mandatory financial audits, term limits for board members, and a resident-led oversight committee with real power to check abuses. Our community became a case study in proper governance, with professionals from across the country visiting to learn how to implement similar reforms. When Maragold wasn't training SEAL candidates, she traveled the country giving workshops on community empowerment and resisting institutional bullying, using our story as a template for positive change. A documentary filmmaker began chronicling the Sunny Pines story as part of a larger examination of HOA abuse in America, bringing national attention to a problem that had been festering in suburban communities for decades. On the 1-year anniversary of the confrontation, our community held a celebration in the same center where Operation Exposure had unfolded. The space had been transformed, fresh paint, new furniture, and a wall of photographs showing community events and volunteer activities that had flourished under the new leadership. Residents who had once been afraid to make eye contact now spoke freely about the bad old days under Wilder and NY's reign, sharing stories of resilience and newfound community spirit. Children played without fear of being cited for noise violations, and elderly residents enjoyed the common areas without anxiety about arbitrary rules. As Maragold addressed the gathering, I felt an overwhelming pride in what my daughter had accomplished. Sometimes the greatest enemies aren't foreign nations or terrorist organizations like I faced in the military. They're the tiny tyrants right in our own communities. And the most valuable lesson I learned from 12 years of training SEALs, not how to take down an enemy, but how to build a community strong enough that people like Wilder never had the opportunity to rise up in the first place. That incorrectly parked car became the starting point for a nationwide movement to transform HOAs. And if you're facing a Wilder in your own HOA, remember, true power doesn't come from a gun or a fake badge. It comes from communities united around a common purpose. The audience erupted in applause, many wiping away tears as they gave her a standing ovation. Maragold had become somewhat of a local hero, but more importantly, she had helped transform a fractured neighborhood into a true community. After the speeches, as people mingled and shared refreshments, I watched her deep in conversation with a group of residents planting a community garden in what had once been an ornamental-only space. She looked truly at home, not just as my daughter visiting her parents, but as someone who had found a new mission as important as her military service. As we drove home that evening, Maragold smiled at the new community sign at the entrance to Sunny Pines. The old metal placard with its list of prohibitions had been replaced with a simple wooden sign reading, "Welcome to Sunny Pines, a community that stands together." In the golden light of sunset, the words seemed to glow with promise. "You know, Dad," she said thoughtfully, "I've spent my career teaching SEALs how to survive in hostile environments. I never thought I'd be using those same skills in a suburban neighborhood." I laughed, feeling lighter than I had in months. Life has a way of surprising us. "When you parked that Jeep, who could have imagined where it would lead?" Maragold nodded, her expression thoughtful. "That's the thing about turning points. You rarely recognize them when they're happening. Sometimes I still can't believe that an incorrectly parked Jeep led to all this." She gestured toward the neighborhood where people were out walking, chatting with neighbors, children playing freely on lawns. But then I remember what I always tell my trainees. The smallest actions can trigger the biggest changes when the time is right. Those words have stayed with me. What began as a simple visit from my daughter sparked a transformation that continues to spread across communities nationwide. Community Shield now operates in 42 states with a growing team of volunteer attorneys, former HOA board members committed to reform, and ordinary citizens who refuse to let power-hungry individuals hijack their neighborhoods. Maragold splits her time between her military duties and leading workshops on community empowerment, having found a way to serve her country on two distinct but equally important fronts. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe if you want to hear more juicy stories about power abusers getting taught unforgettable lessons.